cause was a failure, to quote the famous song, but he was the kind of advocate the Fenians would not have relished. The Fenians were not interested in blood sacrifices, but you cannot get away from what distressed Moody that they were physical forcemen. They were gunmen. That does not mean that they ever really presented a serious military threat. But Eva would surely agree with the Japanese historian of the Dublin Fenians, Shinichi Takagama, that in Dublin in 1867 their problem was, and I'm quoting him, more one of leadership and planning than of popular readiness to take the field, and that they need to be reassessed and their place to be seen in a less romantic and more formidable light. Eva's book is, in a way, a response to Takagami's overall verdict, which was original, I think, when he published his views. And he summarizes them as follows. In other words, the Fenians may deserve more pages than they get in general accounts, and the Fenians and the sympathies they aroused among their supporters may emerge as a more central element in the context of circumstances which changed Ireland in the succeeding 2 generations. Well, we certainly have lots of pages here in this volume. Still on matters military, Eva relates the little-known farcical, really, saga of the Fenian ram, which was the Fenians' very own proto-submarine. This is in New York. Well, to be more precise, that of O'Donovan Rossa and his wing of the movement. Its history, too, is one of splits, subterfuge, and fiasco. It was designed by John Philip Holland, who was the inventor and the designer of the submarine, whose brother was a Fenian. John Philip, anyway, built the submarine, but I guess hadn't been fully paid what he expected. But the Fenians, having forked out $60,000 towards this development, basically captured it, and it remained in Connecticut waters for some years, until lying idle, until it became quite useless and was rotting away. Its remains were then deposited in a museum in New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey. And curiously, it's that same museum which contains the papers of J.P. MacDonald, who was Fenianism's link with Marx and Engels and the First International. One of the highlights of the book is a very long appendix containing short biopics of 1,000 Fenians in Munster and Leinster. Now, this is only the tip of the iceberg as far as people who are active in the movement in the 60s and 70s go. But these biopics are great because they describe hundreds of ordinary Fenians, and in the end you get a sense of people who are just not just names on a page, and sometimes there are photographs appended, which gives the book a humanity. Although little is known about some of those in this appendix beyond their names, and they're being under suspicion or arrested, it's just great to have such data on the spatial distribution of Fenians within this area and also their occupations. And the outcome vividly illustrates what Joe Lee noted nearly half a century ago about the Fenians being a national, bringing a national as opposed to a local perspective to subaltern politics in Ireland, and reaching areas which were, I suppose, previously pre-political in that sense. One might ask, how do Eva's data, which are more comprehensive, square with Takagami's for the Dublin Fenians? Takagami claims that the Dublin Fenians were mainly artisans. They were clerks, skilled workers, and the like. Now, my hastily assembled Excel spreadsheet produces a broadly similar picture, but it suggests a slightly prolier, to use Terry Eagleton's remark. It shows that 21% of those on whom we have occupational data were soldiers or ex-soldiers. Nearly 30% were labourers, another 30% or so artisans, 12% were agriculture, and that meant farmers, son of farmers, agricultural labourers and the like. And then there were teachers and clerks, but only 3% whom you might describe as professionals. So you're talking about unskilled working class through artisanal, very little middle class, hardly any professional. In an era like the present, when the capacity of catastrophic events to traumatize surviving populations is often asserted, the influence of the famine is something that Eva discusses a bit, and one which deserves attention. In the cases of O'Donovan Rossa and Davitt, the link seems pretty clear, because O'Donovan Rossa often alluded to the famine in his lectures. And he also wrote the poem Gillan Andy, which Eva, I think, plausibly describes as the most moving poem to emerge from the famine. It describes the funeral of a friend's wife, and I'll just give you a few lines here. 4 men bear Gillan on a door. 'Tis light, they haven't much of Gillan but her frame. No mourners come, 'cause 'tis believed the sight of any death or sickness now begets the same. And those brave hearts that volunteer to touch plague-stricken death are tender as they're brave. They raise poor Gillan from her tainted couch and shade their swimming eyes while laying her in the grave. That poem actually lived on in West Cork for decades, and it still gets recited at local commemorations of Fenians or O'Donovan Rossa or whatever. But I think it's not widely known, so that's why I read out it's much longer. Eva, as you may have guessed, does not have much time for Vincent Comerford's notion that I don't have long more to go, don't worry. She doesn't have much time for Vincent Comerford's notion that Fenianism was a vehicle for I'm only here for the beer patriots. But what is undeniable is Fenian's influence on Irish pastimes and customs and culture down to the present day. First, the IRB had a crucial role in the creation of the GAA. 2 Fenians were present at the founding meeting in Hayes' Hotel in Thurles, and a few years later, the 3 vice presidents of the GAA were all Tipperary men, IRB men. The first All-Ireland hurling final between Meelick and Thurles, played in Birr in 1888, was essentially a Fenian spectacle, foreshadowing what Eva describes as, and I quote her, almost military scenes before sporting events when the players march around the field, their hurleys on their shoulder as if they were rifles. In the following decade or so, Fenians and softer nationalists fought for control of the organisation. And I think it's fair to say that the Fenians, who were so heavily involved in founding the GAA, also ended up almost wrecking it. But in the meantime, their huge influence on the development is evident in the naming of clubs throughout the country. And that is something which would repay a study of its own. So you have Cooley Kickham's, Ballymun Kickham's, Knockavilla Donaskey Kickham's, CJ Kickham's in Mullinahone, Cregan Kickham's and Ardoyne Kickham's in Antrim, and another Kickham's in Dundrum in Tipperary. In Kilkenny, Johnstown has its Fenians, and the city has its James Stephens. Mayo has Ballina Stephenites. And one could go on with clubs named after John Mitchell, Davitt being commemorated in a long forgotten club called Donnybrook Davits, Carlo Michael Davitt's Belfast, and so on. And then, of course, O'Donovan Rossa is known after the club in Skibbereen. And in 1934, the club in Maharafelt was named after O'Donovan Rossa after, and here I quote from a piece on the club's website, Pat McFlynn proposed the name O'Donovan Rossa having recently read Patrick Pearse's speech, and the name was accepted by the others. Again, you have clubs named after Doheny and John Locke, and one might suspect a Fenian hand in the widespread naming of clubs after Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet. And even after Parnell, after the Parnell split, the IRB tended to support the Parnellite rump of the party. Would there have been a land war without the Fenians? Now, the question is a bit misleading because the land war was never a front for the IRB. But the answer may still be no. Although they did not speak for Fenianism, the new departure that led to the land war was the brainchild of prominent Fenians, Michael Davitt and John Devoy. Against objections from purists like Charles Kickham, Devon quipped that a mere conspiracy would never free Ireland. And certainly without local Fenians, the land war would have been very different. And recent studies at local level of the Land League in West Cork and in the west of Ireland highlight the importance of Fenians as, if you like, the shock troops of the Land League in its early phase. As for literature, Sean O'Phelan reckoned that Kickham's novel Knock na Gao had sold 70,000 copies by 1940, which would have made it the best-selling Irish novel up to that time. And of course, the Fenians then left their mark on the songs. Some people still sing. We have the Bowl Fenian Men, God Save Ireland. Peadar Carney wrote Down by the Glenside in the 1910s. And for good or ill, the songs took on neo-Fenian and non-Fenian lives of their own. Thanks to John Ford, Down by the Glenside made it to a campsite by the Rio Grande, allegedly in 1879, although the song hadn't been composed for another 40 years. By the turn of the century, Fenianism seemed to be in its death throes as an organised movement. In 1901, the London Times noted that, and I quote, "It still lurks in the holes and corners of Irish life." But 6 years later, on hearing of the death of John O'Leary in faraway Trieste, James Joyce noted, and this wasn't really a lament, that O'Leary had little reason to be happy. His plans had gone up in smoke, his friends were dead, and very few people in his country knew who he was or what he had done. And Eva, of course, quotes. This is from Eva. In fact, O'Leary got a great send-off, even though his family wanted his funeral to be private. And although he may have died disillusioned, surely the War of Independence was all that he would have hoped for. There were still lots of what we might call soft or sentimental Fenians around in 1907, which made O'Leary's funeral a pan-nationalist affair, even though the coffin men were still all IRB men. Interestingly, the closing graveside prayers were in Irish, as they would be at the funeral of O'Donovan Rossa. When the IRB was dissolved in 1924, there was no funeral. In 1964, the surviving trustees handed what funds remained over to Kathleen Clark, the widow of the 1916 signatory. And they were used to help fund the Wolfe Tone statue a few hundred yards from here. And that was, I think, a rather fitting ending to the Fenians. So I would like to congratulate Eva and say fair play. She has done much to rescue the Fenians from what E.P. Thompson famously called the enormous condescension of posterity. So, Bramil Mahav.
I feel humbled to stand here before you and speak now. I wish to thank you all for your kind attendance. I see we are... Sorry, can you hear me now? Yes, good. I must say I feel humbled to stand before you you here now. Never in my wildest dreams have I imagined standing in the Royal Irish Academy with such a distinguished audience, which ranges from the Tipperary gentry to the Fenian aristocrats. I can spot several here, and I wish to particularly welcome the descendant of Colonel Thomas Kelly, who led the 1867 Rising, who very kindly travelled to join us here. I think that's just magnificent. And no doubt other Fenian descendants are present here. I wish to thank everybody to help me with the book. I may probably forget some, but we mustn't forget the dead. I wish to remember our friends Colonel O'Neill of Lisrona Clonmel, who gave great encouragement when this whole saga started. It has been in the making since I was 18, I suppose, but it has been particularly intensive in the last 10 years. Colonel O'Neill was very kind and encouraging. Sheila Foley, who is now 90, of Mullinahorn, sends greetings to all of you and congratulations. She's not in a position to travel up here. And I also wish to thank our old friend, I think he lurks there in the background, Jerry Lyne, who was instrumental in introducing me to Lilliput Press. Saga. Yes, Jerry, I'm coming to that, dear. My friends know it has been a long struggle to finish this work and to get it published with flurries to London, Oxford, New York, Dublin archives, and so on. And at a very low moment, Jerry introduced me to Anthony Farrell and Jim and Susie and Karen and their wonderful team. They have been most professional, and it is lovely to be in the hands of a professional publisher. And I also wish to thank all librarians present who have been with me throughout this saga. It was very much like the Fenian movement. First we had the Rising of 1867, which went rather belly up, but today we're celebrating 1916, thank God. And I wish to thank Miss Murray, ex-Bray Library, and my unpaid and permanent research assistant, Michael Kelleher of Bray. And I believe Nigel from Dunleary is also present. And I wish to thank the National Graves Association. They were always very encouraging and very helpful. Our late Secretary, Tess Carney, herself the daughter of a Fenian, kept telling me to keep going regardless. And also our president, he is still with, our ex-chairman is still with us, but he is represented by his son due to old age, Sean Dougal of County Antrim from Dunloy. He also